Thank you for coming in this afternoon's Temasek Distinguished Visitor Series. My name is Ed Araro. I'm a faculty of the school, and I will moderate this talk. We are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Arsenio Balisacan. Dr. Balisacan is a member of the Philippine cabinet. He heads the National Economic and Development Authority, which is the main economic planning body in the Philippines. He has previously held positions in the founding chair of the Philippine Competition Commission, and he has over 30 years of experience teaching at the University of the Philippines, including as Dean of the School of Economics. Dean Balisacan or Secretary Balisacan is no stranger to the Lee Kuan Yew School. Some of his staff are our alumni. Some of his Singaporean close friends are also our alumni. So it's kind of a homecoming for him to come here. So Secretary Balisacan, I would like to invite you to come up to the stage, sir. And before we start, of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors at Temasek for sponsoring this speaker series. Secretary Balisacan will speak for about 30-35 minutes, then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Secretary.
Good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to see familiar places here, and I'm very pleased to see, of course, see again the Dean, good Professor Danny Kwa. And thank you for your generous invitation to me to deliver this Temasek Distinguished Speaker. Of course, to Temasek for sponsoring my visit here. Thank you so much. I am deeply honored to be among the faculty and students here who offer the most interesting and diverse perspective on today's most important public policy questions. I tend to read from the presentations precisely because I am better at managing the time. Otherwise, the 30 minutes would not be enough. So let me proceed this way. So the lecture is divided into two parts. The first part highlights key megatrends shaping or influencing Asia's development path, focusing on the prospects and challenges for the region's small, open, and emerging economies. And this discussion provides the context for the second part, which discusses how the Philippine economy is navigating the journey amid these megatrends to sustain its upward economic growth trajectory and promote inclusivity. So let us start with the first part. What I'm going to say is not new to many of you. Over the past several decades, the world has witnessed several major Asian economies taking significant strides, making the leap and transitioning from developing to advanced economic status within a single generation. China, for example, saw a nearly 28-fold increase in its income per capita, which rose from under 431 US dollar per person in 1980 to over 12,000 by 2023. South Asian giants, that's India and Bangladesh, also saw their per capita incomes grew more than 4 times within that period. Meanwhile, Southeast Asian economies such as Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and especially Singapore, posted a development record that fared better than the global average. These feats, which took advanced Western economies a century or so to achieve, are impressive relative to historical trends and point to Asia's rising economic dominance today. Due to Asia's strong economic performance, the region also saw dramatic improvements in people's welfare. Poverty in Asia and the Pacific has steeply fallen over the last 30 years, with China contributing the lion's share to this decline. While poverty still exists, the near eradication of extreme poverty in certain East Asian contexts is unprecedented, and monumental achievements in modern development history. Health outcomes have improved. Life expectancy has risen, and infant mortality has been cut in half across the region. This indicates how much better healthcare access and services have become with increasing incomes. Scholars and serious development observers have attributed this incredible progress to rapid growth and structural transformations in developing Asia's economies. In the 1960s, more than two-thirds of the region's workforce depended on agriculture for income and livelihood. Today, over half work in industry and services. As a key player in global trade, developing Asia accounts for about 30% of worldwide exports. It has shifted production toward technologically sophisticated, high value added goods, earning the moniker Factory Asia. This shift was propelled in part by forces of globalization, enabled by an openness to trade and investment flows. Coupled with rapid urbanization, this led to broad improvements in the region's living standards and even shared prosperity for the so-called miracle economies of East Asia. That's a phrase coined by the World Bank in publication, and I think this must be 1990, right? Singapore included among those so-called East Asian miracles. However, while this trade and investment-led strategy proved effective in enabling income convergence across economies, allowing poorer nations to catch up to richer ones quickly, it also fueled rising inequalities within countries, as some segments of the population were able to ride the waves of globalization better than others. Macroeconomic imbalances that ultimately precipitated the Asian and global financial crisis were blamed on unfettered market forces. This led to widespread disillusionment with globalization and the institutions and economic configurations propped up by the so-called Washington Consensus. Today, the middle class is feeling squeezed across many developed and emerging economies, particularly in the United States and Europe. Interestingly, this frustration is not directed toward sluggish economic growth, as many economies still exhibit robust expansion. Instead, wages have stagnated, while the cost of living, especially housing, healthcare, and education, has increased dramatically. While millions of households have been lifted from extreme poverty, wealth distribution has become increasingly skewed, with the top 1% capturing a disproportionate share. Median incomes have risen, but at a pace far slower than those in the top 1% and those in the bottom one-third of the population. In the last 2 decades, an increasingly disgruntled middle class has perhaps fueled the proliferation and widespread acceptance of populist and nationalist rhetoric and worsening political polarization, as we have observed worldwide. No contemporary phenomenon provides a stronger indication of globalization and the wane than the re-election of United States President Donald Trump, who recently made good on his campaign promises to impose tariffs on goods from Mexico, Canada, and China. Of course, there's a post for now, for Mexico and Canada at least. Political and economic justifications for such measures aside, the effects are likely to be profound in the months and years ahead. tit-for-tat protectionist behavior among great powers will likely reduce overall global trade and dampen investor appetite, thereby posing downside risk to growth and development, especially among small, trade-dependent economies, including those in Asia. For the latter economies, both the tariffs and, more importantly, the uncertainty about the tariffs are bad for growth. Of course, the trade diversion and the reconfiguration of supply chains may be a boon to some economies, but bane to others as they seek to reposition themselves within the shifting global order. The threat of dumping, for example, looms large as ASEAN, or the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is likely to feel the acute effects of the trade fallout. And political pressures from domestic business groups are likely to shape critical policy stances among leaders seeking to shore up political support, especially in the eves of elections. The recent escalation of import tariffs and quantitative restrictions on trade is part of a broader megatrend that has been diminishing support for free market policies and increasing calls for greater economic self-reliance, more favorable trade balances, and a renewed focus on high-quality job creation within domestic borders. Major powers have engaged in a race for technological supremacy in critical technologies such as artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, renewable energy, and batteries, semiconductors, drone technologies, and robotics that in turn are expected to determine economic and geopolitical dominance in the decades ahead. Industrial policy, which has arguably never really been discarded by developing economies, China in particular comes to mind, appears again to be the policy tool of choice. In 2023, industrial policies have proliferated globally with distinct regional approaches. Advanced economies in North America and Europe prioritize subsidies and procurement to strengthen high-tech industries, while economies in the Asia-Pacific rely more on import barriers and export incentives. Even within regions, strategies vary, reflecting geopolitical and economic priorities and constraints. The rise of nearshoring, friendshoring, and reshoring demonstrates strategic attempts to mitigate geopolitical risk by relocating or diversifying production bases and securing global value chains. Although some emerging markets may gain by securing new investments and strengthening partnerships with major trade allies, others risk being sidelined by losing access to essential capital or being overlooked in newly modified supply chains. The acceleration of AI and robotics adoption, driven partly by this concerted push for technological advancement, it's transforming Asia's economies towards increasing automation, increasing labor costs, improving life expectancies, and declining fertility rates are the main drivers of this trend. As of 2022, 8 Asian economies, including Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Thailand, have elderly populations representing over 20% of their total population. For some of these economies, aging has occurred faster than expected. By 2050, it is expected that 13 more economies cross this threshold. According to the recent work by ADB 2024, by mid-century, Asia could be home to more than half of the world's elderly population. At the same time, fertility rates are falling, with countries like Cambodia and the Philippines expected to see significant declines by 2050. The region's demographic profile is transforming faster than ever, introducing societal pressures on the government and the private sector to provide coordinated responses to strained pension and healthcare systems. There is increasing recognition and acceptance that AI and robotics can help address some of the issues associated with this demographic transition, boost productivity, and raise competitiveness. However, they are likely to displace low-skilled workers soon, even as new job opportunities are expected. According to the International Labor Organization, 56% of jobs in 5 Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, are at high risk, emphasizing the need for reskilling, investment in digital infrastructure, and programs for the protection of vulnerable workers. Finally, as I have mentioned, major economies are facing or racing to secure technological footholds for green technologies as energy transition and climate change mitigation objectives gain paramount importance on the global development agenda. Countries are seeing an increasingly volatile climate not merely as a risk, but as an opportunity to improve their development prospects. However, the push for a greener future is costly, and decision makers must carefully strike a balance as they assess the opportunity cost of massive investments in the sector, especially in the near term. High transition cost, current technological limitations, and poor infrastructure, especially in developing economies, are significant barriers that policymakers must address simultaneously. Asia's low and middle-income countries face a range of megatrends that shape and constrain, or viewed positively, enable and facilitate their development strategies. Yet, these same megatrends can also open up new avenues for growth if acted upon strategically, employing both reactive measures to meet immediate challenges and forward-looking policies to anticipate emerging opportunities. Aspiring to graduate to high-income or developed country status, they must position and reposition themselves, strategically calibrating their policy settings to respond to existing and emerging challenges that they confront. Let me turn to the Philippine economy, having provided the context for those major developments in our region. So against this dynamic backdrop, the Philippine narrative presents a unique set of development challenges and strategic opportunities. While shaped by the same forces influencing the Asia-Pacific region, the country's story also reflects a distinctive historical path and policy landscape. In the 1960s, the Philippines had one of Asia's highest gross domestic product per capita. However, periods of economic policy mishaps and political instability, punctuated by boom-bust economic growth until the turn of the 21st century, resulted in slower growth until the turn of the slower increases in GDP per capita relative to that of its Asian peers. The country's development fortunes have improved through a combination of major and hard-won structural reforms sustained over the last 3 decades. In recent years, macroeconomic trends have been encouraging, which brings the Philippines closer to the dynamism exhibited by its East Asian neighbors. GDP growth in 2010 to 2019, the period before the COVID-19 pandemic, averaging about 6.4% a year, was more substantial than in any other decade since the 1960s. Notably, the economy recovered relatively quickly from its sharpest dip brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, And the 4-year expansion, averaging 6% a year since then, indicates a promising momentum despite a series of external and domestic challenges. Steady improvements in the labor market have accompanied this sustained economic expansion. Both unemployment and underemployment rates have been broadly trending downward, with the unemployment rate reaching levels that are already comparable to those observed in the country's economically dynamic peers. However, job quality remains broadly low. As I will discuss later, sustained growth of investment in the economy's productive sectors and diversification of the economy's growth pillars are needed to generate higher quality jobs. In the last 3 years, the country has faced various challenges affecting value chains for basic commodities. The Russia-Ukraine war and the India rice export ban, which resulted in elevated input and rice prices worldwide, come to mind. Through coordinated policy responses, the government managed to bring down inflation within its target range of 2 to 4%, similar to what our neighbors now are having. Still, risks to the upside remain. Finally, while the country's policy responses to COVID-19 have left it with tighter fiscal space, of course an experience shared by many economies worldwide, our fiscal house remains in order. Following a fiscal consolidation program, the country expects to progressively reduce debt to GDP and deficit to GDP ratios as we rationalize spending priorities, implement more efficient and effective tax administration, closely monitor fiscal risk, and push for more fiscal and budgetary reforms. The country's strengthened macroeconomic fundamentals have steadily spurred inclusive growth, increasing job opportunities, raising incomes, and reducing poverty. Over the past decade, the income growth of the bottom 40% of households outpaced that of the top 20%, leading to a pace of poverty reduction not seen in earlier periods. The government's medium-term target of reducing poverty to a single-digit level by 2028 appears within reach. Productivity growth has also converged within sectors, with initially lower productivity firms growing faster than their higher productivity counterparts. On a regional level, low-income groups or low-income regions have shown more rapid growth than high-income regions, indicating, again, convergence at the subnational scale. The World Bank website, World Bank Manila, has copies of that report on convergence indicators in the Philippines. However, while our macroeconomic fundamentals have progressively improved overall welfare, the Philippines still grapples with deep-rooted structural challenges. As economic development students know, production and employment typically involve a movement from agriculture to industry or manufacturing, and then to services, a natural progression as income rises in the course of development. The narrative has been that in the early stages of development, robust manufacturing growth provides higher quality employment opportunities for the abundant unskilled and semi-skilled labor from agriculture. It also ensures the success of the war on poverty. Indeed, this success is part of East and Southeast Asia's development narrative. Unlike many of our East Asian neighbors, the Philippines underwent the so-called premature deindustrialization at a much lower GDP per capita. Countries like China, Indonesia, and Malaysia began deindustrializing only after reaching higher income levels often above 3,000 GDP per capita. This premature shift has meant that the Philippine economy did not fully capitalize on the benefits of industrialization, especially for high-quality employment and poverty reduction. Like India, the Philippines has leapfrogged towards a service-dominated economy at a low income level. So the question arises, can the Philippine economy sustain growth and achieve inclusivity along this development path? Recent evidence shows that a transition to modern tradable services offers sources of growth and productivity that may be even higher than in manufacturing. There's a recent report on that. The latest report of the IMF looks at the services sector and the structural transformation, past and present. It's a very interesting report. The opportunities opened up by international trade of tradable services such as finance, communication, and business process outsourcing provide higher productivity employment than in mass production factories and traditional services such as tourism. For many years, inadequate investment in essential infrastructure such as energy and water, transportation, logistics networks, and communication facilities has impeded efficient structural transformation by limiting connectivity, perpetuating opportunity divides, increasing business costs, and discouraging foreign and domestic investments. This inadequacy has, among other factors, penalized the country's manufacturing and export sectors, resulting in declining competitiveness in its exports. Burdensome regulations, an uncompetitive currency, and a stagnant and unproductive agriculture sector compound this issue. These factors have caused the country's total level of goods and merchandise exports and its export share of GDP to pale compared to its export competitive neighbors. Examining the growth pillars of the economy, on the demand side, we see that household consumption has long been the main driver of the country's economic growth, historically contributing about 2/3 of GDP growth in recent years. A sizable and a steady inflow of remittances from overseas Filipino workers has significantly boosted household consumption. However, while investment is making up for lost grounds, our exports relative to imports have broadly underperformed, resulting in a negative contribution from the external sector to economic growth over the decades. Recall that in the context of the East Asian countries, in the past of 3-4 decades, it is this investment and exports that have driven rapid growth. The Philippine government produced the Philippine Development Plan 2023-2028 to address various development imperatives. This serves as the country's development roadmap for strengthening the economy's production and social sectors, and establishing a policy and regulatory environment in the medium term. The plan guides the whole government by outlining the programs, projects, and policies it must implement for the country to achieve its development objectives. I have the privilege of leading the crafting of this plan, and the plan from 2010 to 2016, and coincidentally that also was associated with this rapid growth that I described. So hopefully I'm lucky again to have that same rapid growth. But through that plan attempts to address the structural problems that the country is encountering. So of course, in the actual practice of development policy making and program delivery, executing even the most well-crafted plans can turn up against various challenges. And the Philippines provides no exception. Like all other nations, it must carefully assess the lay of the land, an exercise that has become less straightforward, given heightened risk and more significant uncertainties, and navigate its way through all of the megatrends I've discussed earlier. These trends can be opportunities, provided the country plays its card right. For the Philippines to sustain its momentum for sustained growth and inclusion, it must pursue and implement strategies that fundamentally diversify the economy's growth pillars beyond consumption and services. It can do so by enacting game-changing reforms affecting the structure and governance of critical economic sectors such as energy and telecommunication, attracting more investment in sectors providing higher quality jobs, such as in manufacturing and modern tradable services, and extending its reach in regional and global markets, particularly in rapidly growing and urbanizing Asia, to support the external sector. In light of its ambition to achieve high-income country status by the middle of the century, the government must enable the adoption of technologies around the frontier and foster innovation. The government can facilitate this process through various paths such as trade, foreign direct investment inflows, licensing, and the creation of intellectual property, and promoting knowledge sharing within a robust innovation ecosystem. In light of the rapid advancements in strategic digital and green technologies, the Philippines must create the conditions that will allow it to reap the benefits from the global tech race while minimizing disruptions due to possible displacement. Technology adoption and innovation fueling economic expansion will require significant investments in human capital, particularly scientists, technologists, engineers, skilled professionals. Fortunately, the Philippines is well positioned to leverage its dense migrant networks to support capacity building and technology infusion, especially in this age of digital connectedness. More importantly, this calls for policies addressing immigration and encouraging talent to return, such as sufficient funding for research and strengthening academe industry linkages. In addition, like its regional peers in previous decades, the Philippines has entered a demographic sweet spot. Since the 1990s, the country's fertility rate has declined, and the working age population has grown faster than the overall population. In the next few years, the Philippines must take advantage of this demographic dividend by creating a favorable investment climate at the demand side and fostering robust human capital development on the supply side. With the right policies in place, the country could see a robust or a boost in economic growth, allowing us to replicate the experience of many of the country's East Asian neighbors. Recall that 3 or 4 decades ago, when many of our East Asian economies went through that process, that boosted their GDP growth easily by 2-3 percentage points, aside from the usual sources of growth capital coming from capital accumulation and labor. So finally, amid the unfolding trade war and ongoing climate crisis, the Philippines is a small, open economy enormously vulnerable to climate change. Therefore, it must strategically position itself by aggressively strengthening partnerships for trade and investment, development cooperation, and assistance among traditional partners and allies, like-minded nations, and middle powers in ASEAN and beyond. Such partnerships are critical, especially in securing the massive financing needed to build systemic capabilities and resilience, especially for food, water, and energy security, as the country anticipates more frequent and increasingly intensifying climate-related disruptions in the decades ahead. In conclusion, Asia's remarkable economic transformation over the past half century benefited greatly from policies and institutions promoting open trade and investment, significantly as new technologies helped enable an increasingly globalized, rules-based world order. However, various geopolitical and economic stresses that cut across national borders, what I referred to as the megatrends, are reshaping the contours of the development narrative, potentially eroding the gains in recent decades of unprecedented growth for many of the region's emerging economies. The risk that the global economy will further deteriorate is on the upside. Political tensions and economic uncertainty are high. Partnership at the regional and international levels, especially among smaller, open economies caught in the rivalry between economic giants, especially the US and China, is more crucial now than ever. It behooves these economies to embrace coordination and cooperation, a collective action, toward preserving rules-based, positive-sum policy responses to the geopolitical and economic stresses affecting global trade, investment, and technology flows. The Philippine economy has also much at stake in this collective action. To sustain the comparatively high growth rate it has enjoyed in the last 15 years and make the economy more resilient to external shocks, the economy must diversify, adding investment and exports to its predominantly consumption growth driver. Such diversification will engender more robust, high-quality job creation and faster poverty reduction. A favorable environment for global trade and investment is key to the success of the country's drive to sustainable growth and inclusion. Finally, in responding to geopolitical and economic shocks, the country, and as well as many other countries in the region, must consider the lessons learned from its development journey and those of its neighbors. These lessons include maintaining sound economic fundamentals, thereby ensuring that the government's response to such shocks will not compromise the development agenda of sustainable growth and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary, for that very comprehensive presentation of megatrends and a deep dive on the Philippine economy. I should say first, this full disclosure, before Secretary became Secretary, we both belong to the same group of economists in the Philippines, and we rant a lot on the social media about this. Now that he's officially a secretary, he is not active in that group anymore. But Secretary, let me start off with some easy questions first, to warm up the discussion. You ended your presentation on geopolitics, and here we had the dean working on the intersection of geopolitics, security, and trade, and we have colleagues here working on geopolitics. And we had the privilege of watching this from a distance. And here you are in the middle of this dilemma. So the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, long history, and so on. China is a close neighbor, number one trade partner with a border maritime dispute. So as an economic manager, how do you handle this tension between security on one hand, and then on another hand, you have your trade ties to be balanced with China?
The way I look at it is, conceptually, you can separate the two. I said conceptually, not all realistically all the times. But I think as much as you can, you isolate the two so that the political issues would not commingle with economic issues, especially with respect to trade and investment flows. And in fact, that's how the position we are taking with both China and the United States, that while the government has, or the Philippines has treaty with the U.S. With respect to security, we are also saying that we do not discriminate uh, trade and investment by nationality or by country. Everyone is welcome to invest, for example, in the Philippines. We do not. There's no explicit policy or even implicit policy discouraging Chinese investors or Chinese tourists or to come to the Philippines. And in fact, even um, in the first Trump administration, where we already were quite, the Philippines had this good relationship with the Trump administration, and when the U.S. imposed tariffs on China, we hardly had any major problems. And I don't think that it's changed that much. I think that the decrease in the number of tourists that people observe uh, in the Philippines, Chinese tourists coming to the Philippines, or investment from China coming to the Philippines, is a global phenomenon. It's the same for every other country in the region. Because the Chinese economy has slowed down quite a lot after since the COVID. So it's again talk about the answer is no. I don't think that is an issue at this point. We have, of course, the West Philippine Sea issue. That and the president and Premier Jinping had talked that they must keep an open line about on how to resolve these tensions, um, and we never resorted to any aggressive actions
Right.
against.
If you allow me, Secretary, you qualified your answer as conceptually. Safe answer. But at what point when you could no longer separate it conceptually, when it actually happens, when one party really takes action and these two are already mingled? So,
Yeah, if you look at history, lessons of history, things can unravel in so unexpected ways. Small incidents like a killing that happened. Even in that could it's hard to predict what that may be, but our position has always been that, and our ambassador is here. It has always been that we will not take a pro make any actions that will compromise our stance for peace in the region. We firmly believe that it's in the interest of everyone, every country, to maintain peace in the region, and we'll be the last one to take a break from such stance.
okay. Well, I'll have a follow-up question and we'll start opening the Q&A on the floor. The Philippines hosts 9 U.S. military bases, and the presence of the Americans in the Philippines provide a regional public good. And but it's mostly paid for by the Philippines. And President Trump is known to ask for concessions. If I provide you security, you have to pay me something. What is your view of the Philippines asking the United States to pay for these U.S. bases in return for something, for hosting the U.S. bases?
Note that the way we see it is there are high benefits to having a secure and peaceful environment. How I wish we can charge the other countries benefiting from such, but seriously, I mean, we look at the association with the U.S. Not just from the security dimension, but the economy, the personal, these people-to-people relationships. You have so many Filipinos in the U.S. and remittance flow inflows from the U.S. to the Philippines is part of that huge remittances that I described earlier. And so there are many benefits that have been there anyway, even before this installation of some bases.
Right. Okay. Right.
Dennis Hu. I'm from Center of Asia Globalized. Good to see you, RC. So I have two questions. When you talk about ASEAN, the Philippines isn't the first choice of foreign investment destination compared to, say, Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia. So, and partly because of the infrastructure. I think we talked about that. You need good ports, good airports, good roads. So what is Philippines doing about that to try to improve the infrastructure so that they can compete for that FDI with other Southeast Asian countries? And the second point is, you have a slide looking at the Filipino diaspora out there. And we know that, there's a whole spectrum of high-skilled Filipino workers all over the world, Singapore, US, doctors, engineers. And the concern is, of course, that brain drain seems to be irreversible. You see US hospitals coming directly to the Philippines, recruiting nurses, right? So what can be done if you want to have a sustainable growth for the Philippines with high productivity? Then you got to find a way to reverse that brain drain. What can the Philippines do on that? Thank you.
Yeah. The first one, infrastructure. Yeah. The infrastructure, the poor state, comparatively poor state of infrastructure in the country is one of the top issues raised by investors. And the last 10 years I've been aggressively addressing that issue. For example, 2-3 decades ago, the level of infrastructure spending was below 3% of GDP. It's very low compared to what many countries are spending. Today, in the last 5 or 7 years, we are spending 5 to 6% of GDP. That's quite already quite a lot. But the backlog is enormous, and Congress has passed 2 years ago a law that facilitates, reinvigorates public-private partnership so that the private sector can participate more aggressively in public infrastructure projects. And that to us is quite a game changer, because today we have many big projects that are now funded by the private sector. To name a few, we have many expressways that are currently being built under public-private partnership. Our international airport, the main gateway in Manila, was just privatized last year. The 2 regional airports were also just privatized last year. Bridges, new bridges are also right. So many of these now are funded by the private sector. And the reason we have been so keen with that approach is that, as I mentioned earlier, the COVID-19, our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic put stress on the fiscal front. The accumulated debt as a result of that. And so the fiscal space is quite limited. Yet we want to continue the aggressive push for infrastructure development. The other one that why we are keen of opening up the public infrastructure programs to the private sector is we free up a lot of otherwise government resources that would go to these projects, especially projects in urban areas, which can be viable for private sector, the savings can then be used to address the issue on the poor state of human capital. I mentioned the massive amount of capacity building, retaining, reskilling, upskilling in response to the AI challenge. That would require a lot of resources, and so the what would otherwise go to to infrastructure could now go to human capital development, to education, to health. So that's strategic for us. And I think that I don't know of any country now in our region that has as robust public-private partnership framework than what we have now. We started working on this during my first term as cabinet secretary way back 10 years ago. And so when I came back, it was an opportunity to develop it further, and it was a good time because there was the president was current president was liked the idea, and he used his political capital to get that law, and the law essentially made it attractive for the private sector to be engaged because it removes many of the ambiguities and the uncertainties, the risk, the qualify the risk, define the risk properly, especially the allocation of risk between the private sector and the public sector, and so the private sector can see financial viability of these projects. And today, it has saved us billions of pesos of government resources that would have not been otherwise gone to these projects, so that we can support our social protection, our health, our education sectors more aggressively.
Joseph?
Good evening, Secretary. So I'm Seth from the Philippines. I just have two questions, one regional and then one local. The regional one is borrowing a concept from Dean's, the China shock at the end of history. There's a thing called inadvertent cooperation where incentives align, but explicit consensus is not doable. So what specific areas in trade or investment can that concept work with regard to the geopolitical backdrop happening now? So would there be areas of cooperation between like the Philippines and Thailand in tourism? And then the second question is, given the Philippines' very young workforce, the problem is the highly skilled is defined differently by the private sector and the public sector. So in the recent PISA results, the Philippines, I think, is a bit on the bottom part of the results, right? So I think, what are the reforms that address the gap of being highly skilled or being literate, but not translating to workforce quality?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that the COVID-19 and the crisis that we face, the Asian financial crisis, for example, has galvanized collective efforts in our region, particularly I'm referring to the ASEAN. So there are a number of these committees and initiatives that are work out to improve that coordination. I think digital connectivity is quite advanced, and I think that that's one area where all the member countries, the Philippines included, could benefit from a lot. Energy is also another area that we're cooperating on. Of course, apart from cooperation and services, it's more. I think there are more of that in the tourism, in the accreditation of professionals across borders. There are more of that. But there are actually a number of. But I think this the president has in his attendance to the ASEAN meetings asserted and I think push for more more informed and purposive cooperation, among the member countries, particularly on issues that are so critical to the development in the region. With respect to this mismatch between what the government sees as skills versus what the private sectors, the there is now there are regular forums now for that conversation and discussion of involving government, the academe, and the private sector. In fact, what's quite unique now in the administration today that I did not see in previous administrations is quite this very close relationship between the private sector and and the government. The president has a high-level private sector advisory group that meets so often, very regularly. In fact, we are so jealous that as cabinet members that they meet as often as we do. But the way I see it, it works very well because the all these issues about coordination, market failures that we often talked about in classrooms, the asymmetry of information, just like what you are saying, happen in those discussions. The coordination, especially if such coordination involves investment, like in the mining, for example, you need to there's the extraction and there's the processing. If you want a high value mining, you need to have the two, right? But you need to coordinate those two. Otherwise, either one of them will be unprofitable. So that happens a lot now. I think we're quite slow in that sense because this happens much earlier on in East Asia, right? All this kind of industrial policies that. But of course, you are so careful also about this kind of industrial policy. We also have many failures in the past, kind of industrial policy that led to waste of resources. But this time around, I think that we have much more lessons now to learn from.
Yeah, there's a lady here, and then Lawrence.
Good afternoon, Secretary. I'm Abby, Pinoy MPP Junior. So I noted in your slides you mentioned that the Philippines leapfrogged from the traditional growth model. And there has been a recent study on the growing role of servicification, where manufacturing firms increasingly integrate services into their operation. So, given this context, Secretary, how does the growing trend of servicification affect the country's industrialization prospects? And do you think it could be a pathway to reindustrialize the Philippines, or does it further entrench the Philippines in the service-oriented nature of the economy? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that I've been asked of that many times, but I think that the industrialization that we will see in the Philippines is not likely the kind of industrialization that we saw in our East Asian neighbors, particularly China, where you see mass production happening in factories. I don't think that it's the kind of manufacturing or industry that is potential is feasible in the Philippines right now. Labor cost is high partly because your skilled labor are moving out of the country. That's driving the cost of labor also domestically. But we are quite we have a comparative advantage in this modern tradable services, including designs and and we can use that to for manufacturing to increase the value of a manufactured product. A good example of that is the furniture in Cebu. One is individualized furniture that is exported by this furniture maker in Cebu. It has could have the value of one crate of this mass-produced shoes, or that, because these are very high value, bought by high income customers abroad. I think Singapore would be a good customers for that, right? High income society. But yeah, this furniture makers in Cebu export them to Hollywood stars in the U.S. And so that's kind of thing. And many of these are happening. There's still many of them are at inception stage. So they're not that widespread yet, but that's the kind of industry that we and manufacturing that we want to see now. So we have just set up this National Innovation Council that serves as the coordinating agency for mainstreaming innovations as the driver for growth, and hopefully we'll succeed there. I've been trying to reach out with the Singaporeans, with the Koreans, and how we can push for innovation in the country.
On this reindustrialization questions, Secretary, let me tie it back again to geopolitics. So the United States wanted to reshore and friendshore to the Philippines some of its semiconductor business to de-risk. So Philippines partly pays for the cost of securing Taiwan. Taiwan is a leader in semiconductors, but Taiwan never invests in the Philippines compared to Vietnam or other countries. Why is that the case? And whether should the Philippines ask Taiwan, hey, we're paying for your security, can you invest a little?
I think that the problem is found in what I described earlier as the state of the infrastructure in the country, particularly energy. Energy is a big challenge in the country because unlike our neighbors, energy power is fully private, from generation to distribution. And in our other countries, it's state agencies, and and we have come from a regime where power was heavily subsidized, and that led us to fiscal collapse, and would never want to go back to that again. Would not want to go back to that again. But I think that renewable energy is coming now more accessible, more affordable, and we are ramping up investments there. The only issue, of course, is that you can't have renewable as a base load, which your semiconductors and electronics need is a reliable source of energy 24/7, right? And I think that's a concern for electronics in the Philippines. Although if they locate to certain areas like eco zones, processing zones, they can have a reliable energy there. But those zones in the Philippines most of them are now filled up, and so I think it boils down to infrastructure, and that's the one that we are trying to correct. And I think with the massive infrastructure push going on, we should be able to come to the level of the
Yeah. I follow up to this, and then I'll go back to the audience. So the United States promised a civil nuclear reactor program for the Philippines. But last I checked, Philippines is number 22 on the list for a modular reactor. That will not come in the next 10 years.
Well, It's not. Yeah, I was able to talk with the provider from the U.S., but it's not easy. It turned out to just to put up a nuclear reactor, because first the U.S. Congress would have to approve the exports of and then the approval would mean that you would have to show that you have the human capital, you have the institutions and to handle that. The problem for us that in the 1970s, when we were trying to build the nuclear plant, we trained so many engineers and specialists on nuclear energy. Of course, when that did not happen, did not was true. We lost many of those, so we have to restart training again with, and the approval of the U.S. Of the U.S. Congress is critical. I mean, it would require that. So we have to address all these prerequisites.
Yeah, and this transition to renewable energy and batteries. China controls the batteries, solar panels, and wind farm. How do you square this transition dependency of renewable and then dependency on China?
No, as I said, we don't discriminate when it comes to investment. We don't discriminate at all.
What about if China discriminates?
Well, I don't think, what I know about China is that they are more capitalist than the capitalists in the Philippines, right? Where the money is, the capitalists will go. That's what I learned from the Vietnamese colleagues, and I have friends in the Politburo, and what they would tell me, they don't call it profit, but they could call it something else. But
That's a very hopeful point, Secretary. Lawrence.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary. So I'm Lawrence. I'm a PhD student at the school. One of the from something very global as something very local. One of the interesting aspects that I saw in the plan that was provided in terms of the long-term strategy, in terms of the cross-cutting strategies, were the greater collaboration between local governments and national governments. And so, how is the government thinking about that collaboration? In what sectors, priority areas? How are they going to implement something of a local and national collaboration in the Philippines, especially in a very fragmented structure of local governance? And I also, as a follow-up to that, how can devolution and local fiscal strategies enhance this collaboration? So part of the legal environment that we are looking at is the Mandanas-Garcia ruling, which increased the share of local governments in the internal revenue allocation. So in terms of those environment, in terms of more resources to local governments, how is the government thinking about collaboration between national and local governments?
yeah, yes, very interesting question. Yes, for context for our friends here, our laws provide a quite strong support for local government, particularly resources. No? Our Congress has passed a law that provides or that requires national government to share 40% of its tax revenues for to the local governments, and the whole idea is to give to empower the local government to undertake their own development projects, and for the national government not to be burdened with projects that can be better handled by local governments. For example, irrigation, health facilities for the village, things like that. No? So the only problem is that we have very varied level of preparation across LGUs. Um, for richer LGUs like those in Manila, where they have deep sources of revenues, they can that evolve functions like health, education, social protection. They can easily absorb those. And but for poorer LGUs like those in remote areas in poorer provinces, you can't expect them to maintain health facilities or to maintain um, develop irrigation systems for them. So the kind of what we are working on is to have that mechanism such that the equity issue is still achieved by having a kind of a grant system where the national government can continue to provide for the services to LGUs who are not in a position to fund those services. So that it's a kind of learning by doing. Yeah, it's uh, there are hiccups in the implementation, but we're moving there, and we want to push for that because I think that our experience is the local government units are in a better position to identify their constraints for the development and work on them rather than a national government applying a all for one or one for all kind of formula, no? For development.
I'll take one more question and then I'll wrap up with a simple question. Yeah, please.
Good evening, Secretary. Nico here, MPP. I have a question regarding the latest developments in terms of tariffs and trade. So first, my question is that given the U.S. push for reciprocal tariffs and its potential impact on emerging Asian economies, how does the Philippines plan to safeguard its market access for key export sectors and strengthen supply chain resilience, especially in its top exports such as electronics and semiconductors? Thank you.
Uh, the impact of to us, the direct impact on the increases in tariffs, even if the U.S. applies that to the ASEAN countries, would be minimal. But what, as an economist, should be more concerned is the indirect, the global impact. As I said, we need to diversify our pillars of growth. As of now, our growth is very much domestic household consumption driven. Almost 60%, two-thirds of that growth is coming from that. No? And we really need to have that investment and the exports. And so you need a more robust and continuing growth in the global economy, especially rules-based order to get those pillars come in. Because otherwise, it's not only about sustainability, but also the resiliency of that growth. No? A shock can, certain shock can, when you're so dependent on just one source, could make you more vulnerable to shock. Besides, the economy is so small, growing from just household consumption, based on household consumption, will not bring you far. If you are China, yes, they can do that for several decades. It's such a huge country. So much scale economies there. But that's not the case for a country like us. So I think that's
Yeah.
my response.
I have one last question for you, Secretary. We're running out of time. I'll circle back again to the geopolitics and trade. I keep on coming back to this because it's very rare to interact with someone who's in the middle of this.
But I'm not the expert on political economy.
You're an economist. I see one more question, and then I'll come back to that last, my favorite question.
The chair keeps on talking about geopolitics, but let me bring you, Secretary, a question about the politics of the Philippines. This has always been cited as one of the reasons, perhaps, that the Philippines has not really hasn't grown as much as its neighbors because of the nature of its politics. The current administration, as you have described, is very pro-growth. Very much engaging with the international community, works very closely with the private sector, and so he has 3 more years, right? And there is a concern that this continuity that you're talking about is not really guaranteed should there be a new administration. And you saw the changes in the previous administration and the current administration. So I was just thinking, you have been working with different administrations. How do you convince your neighbors and the international community that this growth is going to continue regardless of the changes of politics?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My sense is that anyone who's looking closely at the Philippine economy for the last 3 decades or so, you find that the continuity of policy reforms, particularly structural reforms, has proceeded uninterrupted by all these political noises and all these changes in administration. For example, even as the previous administration and the current administration have different views about international relations, diplomacy, the economic fundamentals have remained largely intact. In fact, the previous administration have introduced reforms that deepen the integration of the Philippine economy with the rest of the world. The current administration has been also continuing opening up the economy even more. So as I see from the 1990s to the present, I see continuity of reforms, and give me a particular structural or policy reform that was reversed. I could not think of any. A major one. That is, so the political noises, yes, noisy, but the economy is, and the sustainability of the policy reforms have largely remained intact. So that's why I am hopeful that whoever comes in, the reforms have, I think, gotten deep enough, and we are ensuring that we go deeper. But of course, you can never really, completely isolate ourselves from these random shocks. There are shocks that can come in, and any country can have that. But I think what I see in the Philippine economic landscape is an interesting story that despite all these political noises and skirmishes, you have the economic fundamentals remain protected and in fact advanced.
Okay, I think that this will be the last question. I'll remove the geopolitics. Let's just focus on trade. You made a very interesting point, Secretary, that China is more capitalist than capitalist. I actually tested this hypothesis. I wrote an op-ed on this. I look at 15 case studies when China used trade to get what it wants. But in all 15 cases, it eventually pulled back and de-escalated. These are normal circumstances, COVID, Dalai Lama, and so on. But my question is, what is the breaking point of this capitalist point when you start to put missiles in the Philippines, China feels threatened, the United States does this and that, and China feels threatened, and they said, no more, enough. We will sanction the Philippines, and we'll teach you the lesson about your behavior. So, how do you deal this breaking? So the normal point, but this breaking point as well.
We'll study futures thinking in Singapore. we don't even have asked for things like that, you know. But I think that you can, I guess that as far, you know, I look at China and Taiwan, and Taiwan, you know, is still Taiwan, right? So I think that I'm quite optimistic in that, but I also don't see that China can afford or find it its benefits to destabilize the region, because it also benefits from a dynamic Asia.
Okay, on that hopeful note, let's give the Secretary. Thank you, Secretary.